by telegraph from Bismarck through St. Paul and Chicago, reached Washington at 3 p.m. on July 6th, 11 days after the first disastrous day of battle. General Sherman received the confirmation during an interview in Philadelphia where he was dismissing the stories of a massacre as speculation. But the skepticism that greeted the first reports made the confirmation all the more shocking. Little Bighorn was compared to the massacres in the past of disastrous military conflicts, like the one led by Major Francis Dade in Florida 1835, or the 1862 uprising in Minnesota in which Sioux under Little Crow killed 644 whites. But the body count alone didn't explain the stunned reaction. There had been more deadly battles in memory. The total casualties at Little Bighorn were small compared with many Civil War engagements. But that war had been over for more than a decade, and the frontier battles with Indians weren't supposed to end this way, that many people thought. So there were many debates immediately after Custer's last stand that argued about what it meant. A New York Times reporter predicted that the affair will be made use of as an argument by those who insist upon transferring the Indian Bureau to the War Department, and also by those who oppose such legislation. It will be made an excuse for increasing the Army and held up as a reason for cutting it down. As with contemporary issues, the battle was viewed through many different lenses, by those with axes to grind or those seeking to place blame. The battle was something like a national Rorschach test where people saw in it whenever they wanted to see. For many, the massacre was a call for all-out war on the Indians. Harper's Weekly ran a cover illustration by Thomas Nast of a diplomat shaking hands with a warrior carrying a bloody club, the angry shade of Custer standing between them, mockingly titled The New Alliance. Colonel William Rowan, a former rebel partisan ranger, offered the services of a regiment of ex-Confederates to avenge Custer's death, to let the world see that we of the lost cause are not deficient in patriotism, he said. But not all former rebels concurred. A Tennessee paper asserted that, given Custer's treatment of Mosey's men at Front Royal and how Custer treated captured Confederates well, he deserved to be degraded by Grant, scalped by Sitting Bull, and hearted by Rain in the Face. Buffalo Bill, who had already begun playing himself on stage shows in the East, had returned to the frontier during the Sioux expedition to scout with the 5th Cavalry. On July 17, 1876, the unit fought a skirmish with the Northern Cheyenne Braves at Warbonnet Creek, Nebraska. Cody galloped toward the Indians and shot the first brave who came into range. He leapt from his horse, tore off the Cheyenne's feathered headdress, and scalped him. Cody raised the gory trophy aloft and said, "The first scalp for Custer." Bill later learned that the man he had killed was named Yellowhair. The Sioux campaign continued into the spring of 1877, but in the end, most of the Indians simply gave up and returned to the reservations. Sitting Bull, Gall, and Rain in the Face fled to Canada. Crazy Horse surrendered, then was killed in captivity. There was no comparable Indian defeat to serve as a bookend to the Custer tragedy. Well, the press jumped on the issue continually. A July 16th New York Herald editorial entitled, "Who Slew Custer?" blamed President Grant for seeking negotiations with the Indians and for the corruption of the agencies that Custer himself blamed for increasing tensions on the plains. The New York World suggested that if Custer had been in overall command of the expedition, it would have turned out differently, and that he died because of Grant's pettiness after Custer's testimony against Belknap. So in the past, the press was perfectly willing to use a tragedy to score political points. The New York Times countered, "No military man ever charged Custer with conservatism, hesitation, excessive deference to the opinion of others, or unwillingness to go in and win." Republicans blamed the Democratic-controlled House Appropriations Committee for refusing to fund outposts on the Yellowstone that would have enabled a more formidable force to take the field. Grant, though, believed Custer bore sole responsibility, saying, "I regard Custer's massacre as a sacrifice of troops brought on by Custer himself that was wholly unnecessary. Wholly unnecessary." But those sympathetic to the Indians saw the tragedy as an ironic outcome of the Black Hills gold rush that Custer helped encourage. The New York Sun blamed Custer's quest for fame. Custer meant to fight alone, and alone win a great battle and harvest the glory of a victory which should put an end to Sioux warfare, the paper wrote. It was a great stake, gallantly but madly played for, and ruinously lost. The dashing cavalryman, charming gentleman, an accomplished scholar, paid his life and the lives of his male relatives and the lives of over 300 of the best soldiers in the Army as a penalty for his rash ambition. Samuel Sturgis, whose son James died in the battle, concurred with the view and said Custer felt he needed to prove himself after being humiliated by President Grant. What I especially deprecate is the manner in which some papers have sought to make a demigod out of Custer and to erect a monument to Custer and none to his soldiers, he said in an interview after the massacre. Custer was a brave man, but he was also a very selfish man. He was insanely ambitious for glory, and the phrase Custer's luck affords a good clue to his ruling passion. General Sherman and Sheridan also thought the attack was ill-considered, though Sherman later told General Thomas L. Crittenden, whose son had also died in the battle, when Custer found himself in the presence of the Indians, he could do nothing but attack. So many accounts of Custer were negative, but in terms of the positive accounts of Custer's life, if we have anyone to thank for that, it's his widow. Libby Custer died over half a century later. She died on April 6, 1933, 2 days short of her 91st birthday. She never remarried, but remained true to George and his memory for the rest of her life. She had to live on a widow's pension of $30 a month and worked for the Society of Decorative Arts in New York, and over time developed talents as a writer. She wrote memoirs of her days with George, called Boots and Saddles and then Tenting on the Plains and Following the Guidon, and also produced commentaries on art, culture, and public life. She defended George and his image in the press and in public, and wrote detailed, though idealized accounts of their life in the West, and bluntly challenged the general's critics when they periodically appeared. She lobbied successfully to take down a statue of George by James Wilson MacDonald that was put on the plain at West Point in 1879 without her approval. Libby gave full support to the statue of George, put up in Monroe in 1910, called Sighting the Enemy. It was by sculptor Edward Potter and portrays Custer at Gettysburg on horseback, looking into the distance during one of the key events of his life. Libby made public appearances on other commemorative events, but she skipped the 50th anniversary ceremony at the Little Bighorn battlefield in 1926, and she never once visited the site of George's death. She lived on Park Avenue later in life, a fixture of New York society. Libby was buried alongside George at West Point. While Custer's legacy continued onward, and the Last Stand became symbolic for much more than its military importance, and became a vehicle for art and literature and history, the tragic romance of Custer began early. Galaxy magazine, which had been serializing George's memoirs when he died, wrote, "Never was there a life more rounded, complete, and symmetrical than that of George A. Custer, the favorite of fortune, the last cavalier. They said to him alone was it given to join a romantic line of perfect success to a death of perfect heroism." They compared the cavalry at Little Bighorn to the Spartans at Thermopylae and said it was Custer's fate to die like Leonidas. Novelist Frederick Whitaker rushed out The Complete Life of George Custer in December 1876, a sensationalized biography that was criticized by some in the military establishment, but it became a popular hit. Walt Whitman admired Custer, and he wrote a death sonnet for Custer, which appeared in the New York Tribune 4 days after news of the battle broke. In this trumpet note for heroes, which he called it, he wrote, "Thou of sunny flowing hair in battle, I erewhile saw, with erect head pressing ever in, front, bearing a bright sword in thy hand, now ending well the splendid fever of thy deeds." Articles, books, poems, and paintings such as these elevated the Custer legend in the decades after his death. Other works emerged that just as fearfully tarnished it or tried to denigrate it. So after more than 135 years, you can find all sorts of versions of Custer as a bloodthirsty fool, as someone who's brave and gallant, a Leonidas. And Custer himself wrote, "My every thought was ambitious. I desired to link my name with acts and men, and in such a manner as to be a mark of honor, not only to the present, but to future generations." He wrote this in 1867, shortly after the Civil War. But the letter continued with a note of humility. "I find myself at 27 with contentment and happiness bordering my path. My ambition has been turned into an entirely new channel. Where I once was eager to acquire worldly honors and distinctions, I am now content to try and modestly wear what I have and feel grateful for them when they come, but my desire now is to make of myself a man worthy of the blessings heaped upon me." So overall, the legacy of Custer is that he grew up a boy of modest means who made a lot of himself very early on. He achieved greatness in the Civil War, and then he spent the rest of his life trying to live up to this legacy built up at this time, but not always successfully. And a nice quote about Custer's life comes from Charles Godfrey Leland, a soldier and scholar who visited George and Libby at Fort Riley in 1869, and he said, "Life is worth living for, or it would be if it abounded more in such types." There was a bright and joyous chivalry in that man, and a noble refinement mingled with constant gaiety in the wife, such as I fear is passing from the earth. Leland said that he worried there will come a time when such books as Libby's will be the only evidence that there were ever such people, so fearless, so familiar with every form of danger, privation, and trial, and yet joyous and even reckless of it all. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. All right, so that is The Complicated Legacy of George Custer. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm always happy to take your questions, and please send them my way, and I will do my best to try to answer them. Okay, so that is all for today. That's today's episode. Thank you for joining me. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our spy masters, Baron Fraser, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to teespring.com/stores/history-unplugged. That's teespring.com/stores/history-unplugged. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books, Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is, you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.